On April 26, 1913, a 13-year-old girl walked into a pencil factory in Atlanta, Georgia to collect her weekly paycheck of $1.20. She never walked out. Her body was found in the factory basement the following morning, strangled, with a cord still around her neck and a handwritten note left beside her. A note the killer had written, seemingly designed to blame someone else for what he had done. Within 48 hours, a man was arrested. Within weeks, he was convicted. Within 2 years, a mob dragged him from a state prison and hung him from a tree. What followed the murder of Mary Phagan was not just a failure of the American justice system. It was a case study in how a community's fear, hatred, and prejudice can manufacture a killer out of an innocent man, and how an entire state can watch it happen and do nothing to stop it. Before we go into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe, because what comes next is one of the most disturbing things a court of law has ever allowed to happen in the United States. It is the spring of 1913, and Atlanta, Georgia is a city in the middle of its own reinvention. The Civil War had ended 48 years earlier, but in the American South, its aftermath was still everywhere. Jim Crow laws controlled nearly every aspect of daily life. Racial segregation was not just legal, it was enforced, celebrated, and defended as the natural order of things. Atlanta was a growing industrial city, proud of its new factories and its new money, but built on a foundation of deep racial and social anxiety. Into this world came a new kind of worker, the child laborer. Thousands of poor white families from Georgia's rural counties had moved to Atlanta looking for factory work. Children as young as 10 and 11 worked full weeks in the city's mills and factories, earning wages that their families could not survive without. It was legal. It was common. And nobody in power questioned it. One of those families was the Phagan family. Mary Phagan was 13 years old, born in Alabama, and had been working at the National Pencil Company factory on South Forsyth Street since she was 12. Every week, she came in to collect her wages. On most weeks, that was the whole of her interaction with the factory. She was not a full-time employee by this point. Child labor reform laws had recently cut her hours, but she still came in on paydays. On the morning of Saturday, April 26, 1913, Mary Phagan put on a new dress, lavender, bought recently, one she was proud of. She ate a breakfast of cabbage and bread at home. She told her mother she was going downtown to collect her $1.20 paycheck from the factory, and then planned to go to the Confederate Memorial Day parade on Marietta Street afterward. She left the house at around 11:30 in the morning. She was seen alive by multiple witnesses on the streetcar into town. She arrived at the factory just after noon. She was never seen alive again. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, April 27, 1913, Newt Lee, the night watchman at the National Pencil Company factory, went down to the basement to use the toilet. He found a body on the floor. He ran to the nearest call box and telephoned the Atlanta police. Officers arrived within the hour. What they found was Mary Phagan, face down in the dirt of the factory basement, a cord tied around her neck, her new lavender dress torn. Her face was blooded. There was a wound on the back of her head. And lying near her body were 2 handwritten notes. The first note read, "He said he would love me land down play like the night which did it, but that long tall black Negro did boy his sleff." The second, "Ma'am, that Negro higher down here did this, I went to make water and he pushed me down that hole, a long tall Negro black that who it was, long slim tall Negro I write while I lay." The notes were written in broken, barely literate English, designed, as investigators would later note, to sound as though they had been written by a black man. Whether they were written by the killer himself, or dictated to someone, or written in advance to frame another person, was a question that would take over a century to fully answer. The medical examiner determined that Mary had been strangled. The time of death was estimated at early afternoon on April 26, meaning she had been killed within hours of arriving at the factory to collect her paycheck. The factory superintendent was Leo Frank. He was 29 years old, Jewish, from Brooklyn, New York. He had moved to Atlanta to run the factory for his family's business. He was well educated, spoke with a northern accent, and in the culture of 1913 Atlanta, he was already an outsider before a single piece of evidence had been examined. Police called Frank at home early on the morning of April 27 to inform him of the murder. Officers who spoke with him that morning later described him as nervous, shaken, not acting the way they expected a man to act. In the Atlanta of 1913, that description alone was enough to make Leo Frank the primary suspect. The investigation into Mary Phagan's murder was not a search for truth. It was, from almost the very beginning, a search for confirmation of what the investigators had already decided. The Atlanta Police Department, under pressure from a city in an uproar over the murder of a young white girl, moved fast. Too fast. The first man arrested was Newt Lee, the black night watchman who had discovered the body and called the police. He was arrested within hours. He had no motive, no evidence against him, and had been the one to alert authorities. He was held anyway. Then police turned their attention to Leo Frank. The case against Frank was built largely on the testimony of one man, Jim Conley. Conley was a janitor at the factory. He was black. He had a criminal record. And when police questioned him, he initially lied, multiple times, about his whereabouts on the day of the murder. When his lies fell apart, Conley changed his story. He told police that Leo Frank had summoned him to the factory on the afternoon of April 26, that Frank had shown him Mary Phagan's body, and that Frank had instructed him to write the notes found near her body, dictating the words to Conley himself. He claimed Frank had paid him to help move the body to the basement. Jim Conley, a man who had already been caught lying to police multiple times, was about to become the star witness in a murder trial. The prosecution chose to believe Conley's final version of events completely. Not because the evidence supported it, but because it fit the story they wanted to tell. There were serious problems with Conley's account that any thorough investigation should have examined. The notes found near Mary's body, supposedly dictated by Frank to Conley, matched the handwriting style of notes Conley himself had written before. Several factory workers testified that Frank was not alone on the afternoon in question, contradicting parts of Conley's timeline. Physical evidence from the crime scene was inconsistent with the basement being the primary location of the murder, suggesting Mary was killed elsewhere in the building and moved. And Conley himself had the knowledge, the access, and the motive to have committed the crime himself. None of this stopped the prosecution. The trial of Leo Frank began on July 28, 1913, less than 3 months after Mary Phagan's murder. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered daily, shouting, chanting, calling for Frank's conviction. The judge in the case later stated that he had been afraid a not guilty verdict would have resulted in immediate mob violence inside the courtroom. He had been afraid, he said, for the jury's safety. Think about what that means. The judge presiding over a murder trial believed the jury would be attacked if they returned the wrong verdict. And the trial continued anyway. Antisemitic sentiment ran through the trial like a current. Local newspapers, most prominently the Atlanta Georgian, led by Tom Watson, ran inflammatory editorials portraying Frank as a predatory northern Jewish man who had used his position of power over a poor southern girl. Watson's editorials would later be seen by historians as a direct catalyst for the mob violence that followed. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. On August 25, 1913, Leo Frank was found guilty of the murder of Mary Phagan and sentenced to death. For 2 years, Leo Frank sat on death row at the Georgia State Penitentiary in Milledgeville. His legal team filed appeal after appeal. The case attracted national attention. Lawyers, journalists, and civil rights advocates across the country argued that Frank had not received a fair trial. Among those who examined the case and became convinced of Frank's innocence was Georgia Governor John M. Slayton. In June 1915, just days before Frank's scheduled execution, Governor Slayton reviewed the entire case record. He studied the evidence, the trial transcripts, and the physical facts of the crime. And he reached a conclusion that would cost him everything. On June 21, 1915, Governor Slayton commuted Leo Frank's death sentence to life in prison. The reaction in Georgia was immediate and violent. Slayton's home was surrounded by a mob. He required National Guard protection. He and his wife were forced to leave the state. His political career was finished. In Georgia in 1915, believing a Jewish man deserved a fair trial was enough to end your life in public service. But it was not enough to save Leo Frank's life. On the night of August 16, 1915, a group of approximately 25 men, many of them respected members of Georgia society, including a former governor, a former judge, and lawyers, drove to the Milledgeville prison farm. They overpowered the guards, took Leo Frank from his cell, put him in a convoy of cars, and drove through the night to Marietta, Georgia, the hometown of Mary Phagan. At dawn on August 17, 1915, they hanged Leo Frank from an oak tree. Afterward, the crowd that gathered was photographed smiling. Some posed for pictures with the hanging body. Pieces of Frank's clothing were sold as souvenirs. A local newspaper published photographs. No member of the mob was ever charged with a crime. Not one. Not a single person. Despite the fact that many of their identities were known. The men who murdered Leo Frank went on with their lives. Some of them went on to hold public office. Several of them helped found a new organization later that same year, one that would use Leo Frank's lynching as a founding moment of inspiration. That organization was the Second Ku Klux Klan. For decades, the official record of the state of Georgia maintained that Leo Frank was guilty. The case was closed. The matter was settled. Then, in 1982, an 83-year-old man named Alonzo Mann came forward. Mann had been 14 years old in 1913. He had worked as an office boy at the National Pencil Company. On the afternoon of April 26, 1913, the afternoon Mary Phagan was murdered, Alonzo Mann said he had come back to the factory to retrieve something he had forgotten. And he had seen Jim Conley in the lobby of the factory, carrying Mary Phagan's limp body toward the basement stairs. Conley had seen him too. Conley told the boy to say nothing, or he would kill him. Alonzo Mann, 14 years old, terrified, had gone home and told his mother. His mother had told him to stay out of it. He had stayed silent for 69 years. 69 years. Leo Frank was murdered in 1915. The truth existed in 1913. And it stayed buried until 1982. Alonzo Mann passed a polygraph examination. Investigators and historians who reviewed his account found it consistent with the physical evidence from the crime scene, evidence that had never fit neatly with the theory that Frank was guilty. In 1986, 73 years after Mary Phagan's murder, and 71 years after Leo Frank's lynching, the State Board of Pardons and Paroles of Georgia granted Leo Frank a posthumous pardon. Not an exoneration. A pardon. The board stated that the state had failed to protect Frank from the mob that murdered him, but stopped short of officially declaring him innocent. For the Frank family, and for many legal scholars, that distinction still stings. Jim Conley, the man who almost certainly murdered Mary Phagan, who wrote the notes designed to frame someone else, who testified falsely in court, and whose testimony sent an innocent man to his death, was never charged with murder. He served a sentence for accessory after the fact. He was released. He died in 1962. The Mary Phagan case leaves three things that anyone who cares about justice needs to understand. The first is about what happens when a community decides it already knows the answer before the investigation begins. Leo Frank was convicted not because the evidence proved he was guilty, but because the crowd outside the courthouse had already decided he was, and the system inside the courthouse did not have the courage to disagree. When fear and prejudice drive a criminal investigation, the investigation stops being a search for truth. It becomes a search for a target. The second is about the cost of silence. Alonzo Mann was 14 years old when he saw Jim Conley carrying Mary Phagan's body. He was frightened. He told his mother. And his mother told him to stay out of it. That choice, understandable, human, made by a frightened boy and a protective parent, allowed an innocent man to be convicted, to be lynched, and to remain officially labeled a murderer for 69 years. Silence in the face of injustice is never neutral. It always has a cost. And sometimes that cost is paid by someone who had nothing to do with your decision to stay quiet. The third is about Mary Phagan herself, because in the frenzy over Leo Frank's trial and lynching, it is easy to forget that a 13-year-old girl was murdered in a factory basement on a Saturday afternoon in April 1913. She had put on her new lavender dress. She was going to watch the parade afterward. She had eaten breakfast with her family that morning. She was a child who went to collect $1.20 in wages and never came home. And the person who most likely killed her, who wrote notes to frame another man for it, who testified in court to send an innocent man to death, served minimal time and died quietly of old age 50 years later. Mary Phagan never got justice. Leo Frank never got justice. And the state of Georgia has never fully admitted what it allowed to happen. In 2000, the National Pencil Company building on South Forsyth Street in Atlanta was converted into luxury apartments. The basement where Mary Phagan's body was found is now a parking garage. The oak tree in Marietta where Leo Frank was hanged was cut down decades ago. There is no marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate what happened there. Some things are easier to demolish than to remember. If you've watched this far, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you think more people should know what really happened in Atlanta in 1913, share this video. Because the least we can do for Mary Phagan, after everything, is make sure her story is not forgotten.